The broker did not inspect the cattle first. He inspected the woman holding the red ledger. Then he smiled at the book like it had made a joke. Ruth Calder stood beside the check, in counter at the Prairie Gate livestock auction, with 46 head waiting outside in the morning dust. The cattle were calm, wide through the middle, slick coated, not tall enough for fashion and not polished enough for a catalog cover. But they were exactly what Ruth said they were. Vernon Pike barely opened the ledger. He saw the tabs. He saw the columns, birth dates, pasture rotations, winter feed notes, breeding records, vet bills, death loss, sale weights, every number Ruth had spent years collecting. Then he pushed it back across the counter. Ruth watched his hand more than his face. That bothered her later. Not the insult, not the sale, the hand. The way he moved the ledger away before he had read enough to be dangerous. Vernon looked through the window at the pens. How many? 46. What are they? Ruth answered plainly. Grass. Raised composite bred heifers. Calder line. That was when Vernon smiled. Not a big smile. Worse. A little one. The kind of smile a man uses when he believes the conversation is already over. Calder line, he repeated. Ruth waited. Vernon flipped the red ledger shut with 2 fingers. I'll save you a bad morning. The clerk behind him stopped typing. Ruth said, Meaning? Vernon leaned back. Perfect hat. Clean vest. The relaxed confidence of a man who had stood beside sale rings for 30 years and mistaken proximity for wisdom. Meaning those cattle won't bring what you think. Ruth looked out at the pen. They have never missed a bred-back year. Buyers don't bid on notebooks. They bid on cattle that work. Vernon's smile thinned. No, he said. They bid on cattle they recognize. The sentence landed harder than he intended, because Ruth knew he was right about one thing. Recognition had power. It just did not always have value. Calder Ranch sat on a hard piece of Kansas grass that punished pretty theories. In wet springs, the hills turned green enough to make a banker generous. By August, the wind could rub the color out of everything. The place had belonged to Ruth's grandfather, Amos Calder, who believed a cow should earn her place twice a year. First when she raised a calf, and again when the feed bill arrived. When Ruth was 13, Amos walked her through the north pasture after a storm. The grass was wet against her boots. Red cows grazed low along the slope. He pointed with his cane. What do you see? Ruth said. Cows. Amos nodded. Everybody sees cows. He waited until she looked again. Then he said, I see groceries we didn't buy. At 13, Ruth laughed because it sounded like one of his strange old man sayings. At 41, she understood exactly what he meant. A profitable herd was not always the heaviest herd. It was not always the tallest, flashiest, or most photographed. It was the herd that converted grass into calves without begging the rancher for rescue. Amos bred for that. Moderate frame, strong feet, good udders, calm temperament, easy calving, heat tolerance, cows that stayed fleshy on native grass and bred back when neighboring herds needed extra tubs, extra hay, extra money. By the time Ruth inherited the ranch, the cattle looked almost old-fashioned. That became the problem. Order buyers wanted uniform black hide. Magazine men wanted numbers that sounded impressive at lunch. Neighbors wanted whatever the last high sale made look smart. Ruth wanted cows that could survive a bad year without turning the ranch into a loan application. So she kept the red ledger. Every calf entered. Every cow tracked, every bag of mineral, every vet call, every bale, every open female marked in black ink and removed. Her neighbor Lyle Mercer teased her about it for years. Lyle was not cruel, just ordinary, which was sometimes harder to argue with. One June evening, he leaned on the fence while Ruth sorted heifers. "You know what your trouble is." Ruth did not look up. "The county has offered several opinions." Lyle pointed at the cattle. "They're too plain. They're not supposed to be jewelry. They're supposed to sell." Ruth closed the gate and wiped dust from her palm. "They're supposed to make money before they sell." Lyle frowned like she had shifted the ground under him. "That's not how the market talks." Ruth looked across the pasture. The heifers were grazing calmly, heads down, doing the quiet work no sale ring could fully measure. "Maybe the market talks too much," she said. "For years." That answer cost her. Not directly. Nobody sent her a bill for being different. They just discounted her. A broker would glance over her cattle and ask if she had anything more conventional. A buyer would compliment the condition and still bid cautiously. A feed salesman would explain what bigger-framed cattle could do if she pushed them. Ruth stopped arguing. She kept records instead. Then came the dry year. It started with a spring that looked promising, then betrayed everyone by June. Ponds shrank at the edges. Hay prices climbed before the first cutting was even done. At the co-op, men stood around coffee cups and talked like the weather had personally cheated them. Ruth's daughter, Nora, came home from college that summer and found her mother at the kitchen table near midnight. The red ledger was open. So was a stack of printed spreadsheets. Ruth had feed receipts, pasture maps, pregnancy checks, and sale sheets spread across the table in separate piles. Nora stood in the doorway. "That looks serious." Ruth did not look up. "It is? Bank serious?" "No." Nora came closer. "Then what kind?" Ruth tapped the ledger. "Proof serious." Nora sat down. The numbers were better than they should have been. In 5 harsh grazing seasons, the Calder heifers had held a 94% bred rate. The ranch used less winter supplement per head than any year Ruth could find in the old record. Calving assistance had happened 3 times in 5 years. Veterinary costs stayed low. Culls were few. Replacement value kept climbing because everybody suddenly wanted cattle that did not collapse when feed got expensive. The market was beginning to ask a new question. Not, what looks good? What can stay in business? That was the whole difference. 2 weeks later, she drove to Prairie Gate with the red ledger on the passenger seat. Vernon listened for less than 6 minutes. Ruth explained the bred rates, the winter feed savings, the cow families, the drought performance, the way the calves held condition on grass without a feedlot. Style push. Vernon looked toward the window. Then he said, "Ruth." She stopped. He took off his glasses and folded them. "You need normal cattle for a premium sale. These are premium cattle." "No," he said. "They're useful cattle." Ruth stared at him. He seemed to think useful was a smaller word. It was not. 3 weeks later, the insult became public. The co-op was crowded that morning. Feed prices had jumped again. A rancher from Cedar Creek had sold pairs early. Someone else was talking about cutting the herd down before winter. Vernon walked in and received the usual attention. Men asked him about prices, demand, weight classes, the fall run. He answered like a weather vane wearing boots. Then he saw Ruth by the coffee counter. The room shifted. He smiled. Still hauling those Calder cattle next Friday? Ruth said, yes. Lyle looked from Vernon to Ruth and stayed quiet. Vernon shook his head. I wouldn't. The words were soft enough to sound private and loud enough for everyone. Ruth said, why not? Vernon lifted his coffee. Because fuel is worth more than the trip. No one laughed. That made it worse. A laugh would have scattered the insult. Silence held it in place. Ruth put the lid on her coffee. Her hand was steady. She looked at Vernon, then at Lyle, then at the men pretending not to listen. Finally she picked up the red ledger from the counter and tucked it under her arm. Then I guess I'd better not waste the return drive, she said. The sale barn was already loud when Ruth arrived the following Friday. Metal gates clanged, cattle bawled, dust hung in the light under the roof beams. Men leaned over rails, judging muscle and hide and frame with fast eyes. The air smelled like straw, manure, coffee, and nervous money. Ruth checked every tag herself, 46 head, every heifer bred. Everyone raised on the same pastures that people called unimpressive. Lyle found her near pen 12 for once. He did not joke. You all right? Ruth looked into the pen. No, he blinked. She turned the red ledger in her hands. But I'm accurate. That was the only comfort she trusted. The early lots moved normally. Some strong, some soft. A few disappointed sellers walked away, pretending not to care. Vernon stood near the ring with his arms folded, speaking quietly to buyers as cattle moved through. Then pen 12 opened. The first Calder group entered the ring, and the room changed in a way Ruth felt before she understood it. The talking did not stop. It tightened. Buyers leaned forward. One man looked down at the catalog, then back at the cattle. Another stepped closer to the rail. The auctioneer started briskly, expecting a cautious opening. He did not get one. The first bid came fast, then a second, then a third from the back row. Ruth kept her face still. Lyle whispered, "That's already above." She did not answer. The bid climbed again. These were not hobby bids. Ruth could hear the difference. Commercial men bid differently when they were curious. They hesitated. They let someone else reveal the heat. But when they know what they are looking at, their hands move quickly. The first group sold strong. The second group sold stronger. By the third group, buyers were asking questions between lots. Are they bred the same way? What hay did she have in them? Any creep feed? Where's the ranch? One older buyer from Nebraska came down from the seats and stopped beside Ruth. You raise these yourself? Yes. How long you been building them? Ruth looked at the ring. Longer than people have been laughing at them. The man nodded once. Not amused, respectful, I figured. That was when Ruth finally breathed, because the cattle were no longer being seen as odd. They were being seen as answers. The sale kept building. Each pen revealed the same thing the ledger had already said. Uniform without being fashionable. Fleshy without being overfed. Calm without being dull. Bred without excuses. Vernon stopped smiling before the last group entered. Ruth noticed. She wished she had not. The last lot brought the strongest bidding of the day. Two buyers pushed each other past the number Vernon had said was impossible, then past the number Ruth had quietly hoped for, then into a place where even the auctioneer's voice sharpened. The hammer fell. The ring moved on, but Ruth did not. A clerk brought the settlement sheet 20 minutes later. Ruth held it in both hands. 46 head, $371,200. She read it once, then again. Then she passed it to Lyle. He looked at the number and forgot how to speak. Finally he said, "That can't be right." Ruth's mouth moved into something almost like a smile. "It matches the math." Lyle looked at her, then at the cattle leaving the back gate, then back at the sheep. For once, he did not have an opinion ready. News traveled through Osage County faster than rain. By supper, people had heard a version of the sale. By breakfast, they had improved it. By Sunday, 3 men claimed they had always liked Calder cattle, which was impressive because Ruth remembered all 3 saying the opposite. The awkward part came the next Tuesday. Ruth walked into the co-op with the red ledger under her arm. Conversations thinned, not stopped. Thinned. Vernon was at the coffee counter. Lyle stood by the mineral display. Ruth poured coffee like nothing had changed, because in the important ways nothing had. The ranch still had fences to fix. Cows still needed checking. A good sale did not make rain. Vernon cleared his throat. "That was a remarkable sale." Ruth looked at him. "Yes," he nodded toward the ledger. "Guess the buyers liked your cattle." The room waited. Ruth could have said several things. She could have reminded him about the fuel. She could have embarrassed him with his own words. She could have made the room pay interest on every year it had discounted her. Instead, she opened the red ledger and laid it flat on the counter. "No," she said. Vernon frowned. Ruth tapped one column, then another. They liked what the cattle had already done. No one moved. Ruth turned the page. "These are bred rates. These are feed costs. These are calving notes. These are cull reasons. These are the cows that stayed profitable when everyone said they were too plain." Vernon stared at the ledger as if it had changed languages. Ruth closed it gently. "You looked at them and saw cattle you didn't recognize." She lifted the ledger. "I looked at them and saw evidence." That sentence lasted longer than the coffee. Over the next few years, the questions changed. Not all at once. Pride has a long withdrawal period. But ranchers began asking Ruth about pasture rotations, about moderate frames, about cow longevity, about keeping records that actually meant something. Lyle started bringing a notebook when he visited, though he pretended it was for feed calculations. One evening in October, he stood beside Ruth above the south pasture. The grass was copper in the low light. Cows moved slowly below them, heads down, turning rough hillsides into tomorrow's calves. Lyle folded his arms. "You know what bothers me?" Ruth said. "I can narrow it down." He almost smiled. "I looked at them for years. So did Vernon. That's not what I mean." Ruth waited. Lyle nodded toward the herd. "I saw plain cattle." Ruth looked at the same cattle and felt the old familiar quiet settle around her. The kind Amos had trusted. The kind the market missed when it was too busy talking. "Most people did," she said. Lyle shook his head. "But you saw the business." Ruth did not answer right away. Down in the pasture, a red heifer lifted her head, then lowered it again to graze. Ruth thought about the sale ring, the settlement sheet, the co-op silence, Vernon's hand pushing away the ledger before he understood what it held. Then she said, "No." Lyle looked over. Ruth smiled faintly. "I saw the cattle. For years, people had called them too small, too plain, too different, too far from the market. But the market had only been measuring what was easy to see. Ruth had measured what mattered. The broker trusted recognition, the buyers trusted the ring. Ruth trusted the grass, the cows, and the red ledger full of proof no opinion could erase. And when 46 head finally walked under the auction lights, one man's confidence bought coffee. Room silence. Her numbers bought the ranch another generation.